So this is Shelly Polchis from my community, and I'm going to be interviewing her today and asking her a few questions. So the first question is, what was it like for you growing up being both Indigenous and female?
I think that when I think about growing up, I think more about being indigenous in general, not so much about my gender. But I definitely faced a lot of racism in school, in my social settings, sometimes through organized sports. I I would say for the most part it was somewhat subtle, but looking back I can see more clearly now that I understand better that subtle or not, it was wrong. And yeah, so just even growing up in a First Nations community to boot, not just because I was Indigenous, like I had friends who weren't allowed to visit me at my home. Sometimes I couldn't even, or I wasn't welcome at their homes if they were non-Indigenous, based on stereotypes and those sorts of things. Sometimes I had friends I could go to their house, but they weren't allowed to come to mine just because I lived on the reserve.
I went through the same experiences too, and I'm only 24.
Right.
And
So
it was like they're not
changed.
allowed onto the reserve, and the reserve is a scary place.
Yeah. So just like those kinds of things. But on the flip side of that, I also remember growing up, and back then I felt like we were more community oriented. Families gathered in each other's homes on a more of a regular basis, like within the community. We practiced doing more traditional things. They just seemed normal based on whatever season it was, like fiddlehead picking, fishing, hunting, those sorts of things. Like I did that stuff with my dad and my parents. And sometimes as a community, fiddlehead picking was like a big camp out. It was something we looked forward to every year. Like everybody went to the islands. We traveled on boats across the islands, and like we set up camps for like a weekend. So the kids got to play together for the weekend. It was a lot of fun and a lot of good memories. So now I feel like we're less community oriented, and but I also feel like racism is more recognized and acknowledged, and therefore not as blatant, I guess. Even though it does exist and it'll probably never go away.
Hopefully it will someday, but okay. Next question is, what is your role in the community?
In the community, I work as the recreation director, and I've been in this position for over 8 years now. I've also sat on council as an elected member for like 11 and a half years. This is my 6th term, and friend, mother, grandmother.
What made you want to run for council? Did you want to make a change into the community?
Well, I just felt like my heart has always been and will always be for the betterment of the community, period. The individuals who live here, the people who don't live here but have connections here, for the children specifically. And just wanting to work with other people, other like-minded people, and hopefully bring about change, positive change for our community.
Awesome. And then the next question is, can you please list a couple traditions that you've taken part in, and why do we do these traditions, and what do you get out of these experiences? But you kind of already answered that for the fiddleheading.
I did, and when we initially discussed this, I never thought of those things, right? They are traditional hunting. Like I hunt every year. Sometimes I hunt for bird, partridge specifically. I've been deer hunting. It's not my favorite because it requires so much patience. And I love moose hunting. and I have shot a moose before, and I helped
That's great.
clean it and all those things. I fish. I love fishing. And fiddlehead picking. Try to get out annually to pick some fiddleheads. There's been a couple years that I haven't gotten out, but I do enjoy doing it. I do canoe with my family. We do canoe runs, and I have and I do participate in sweat lodge ceremonies. I'm sure there's other things that I have done, but these are some of the things I do on a more regular basis.
That's good. And the next question is, what does respect mean to you?
Respect to me is like a high level of admiration for someone, or if someone respects me, I feel like they have a real high level of admiration for me, and consequently they'll consider my feelings, my traditions, my culture, and it'll be important to them.
Do you still believe in the respect your elders?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I feel like if you're someone I look to as an elder, I have a whole lot of respect for you, and I value your opinion and your teachings. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is, how has residential schools affected you?
Residential schools has affected me because residential schools affected my dad, and so it affected the way that I was parented. Like, I mean, I never wanted for anything. Like, my needs were always met. I felt like some more than others. For example, like, saying goodbye every morning and every night, or I love you every morning and every night, to my daughters is common. We do it. Like, I drop her off at school every morning. Have a good day. I love you. Bye. And at night, it's the same thing. Before I turn in for the night, I always go into her room and say, I love you. Good night. See you in the morning. When I was growing up, I don't recall that happening. It wasn't something that was regular. And so I grew up almost like affection was kind of like bizarre to me. So I dated a couple people, and they were very affectionate family, and I was just like, oh, like, why do they always have to hug me every time I come to their house, or every time I'm leaving? Like, this is so weird. But thinking back, I feel like that is a direct result of residential schools. So my dad probably lacked that too, because his parents attended residential school. My dad attended day schools. So there's not a doubt in my mind that some of the experiences I have had, sexual abuse as a child, you couldn't convince me that wasn't deeply rooted into somebody's experience somewhere at residential schools, and that still affects many people in our communities. So
I agree 100%.
Yeah.
That's amazing. The next question I have is, do you have any fluent speakers left in your family?
My dad, like, he speaks it, but it's like, I feel like it's broken. My auntie, she's pretty fluent. Both of my grandparents were, and I can remember taking a language course at UNB when I did my degree, and my grandpa actually, we went to his house, like, and he spoke to us in the language, and he taught us how to make Indian bread. So I remember my grandparents speaking it in the house, and I took it in school, but obviously I'm not fluent in it, but I could always understand what they were saying to me. Like, I couldn't speak to them, I couldn't have a conversation in the language with them, but I always knew what they were saying when they spoke to me. I don't know if it was the nonverbals or what, but yeah, it's interesting.
All right, next question is, what do you think of missing and murdered Indigenous women? The movement.
Well, I mean, obviously it's like a pandemic in our country, and the USA as well. I think that it should be taken more seriously. I don't think that it's taken serious enough, and I think that it boils down to the fact that people have less respect for Indigenous women. They have their they have their views on them based on stereotypes, and they're seen as less valuable, which I obviously don't agree with.
Obviously. Is there any guidance or advice you would like to share with any other female Indigenous women in our community?
The biggest piece of advice that I give young women, and it men as well, is your actions affect how you view yourself and how you feel about yourself. Making positive and good choices in your life will directly reflect your perception of yourself. If you respect yourself, you'll make good choices. And if you respect yourself, those good choices will result in you having the ability to shift how non-Indigenous people view us. And I think that the more experiences that non-Indigenous people have with people who have self-respect, the more serious they take a lot of these different movements that we see happening nationally. And another thing is to use your voice. Like, don't be scared to use your voice. You are given a voice for a reason. Believe in yourself. Have courage in the moments that you're not so sure about yourself. And to remember that we have to always make choices based on the generations to come.
And how important is it to you to keep our traditions alive as well as our culture, and why?
It's super important to keep our traditions alive, our language alive in particular, because it's who we are. It's the core of our being. If we can instill our traditions into our daily life, it helps us with our self-esteem. And like I just said, like, self-esteem is so important in your life. Like, it really does. It's like the trajectory of your life. Like, it steers you, and if you have it, then I feel like you're gonna go down a good path in life, and you're gonna make change, and you're gonna be the person that people grow up respecting in your community. And your traditions are deeply rooted in that. It's who you are. It's your soul. It's your spirit. And if you can stay grounded in your traditions, I feel like it'll keep you on a road that's full of integrity and respect and love.
I feel like a lot of people think that we have to fall into the roles of these stereotypes just because my mom's an alcoholic, that means I'm gonna be an alcoholic, but that's just not true. And I feel like it's just because we feel lost a lot of the time. Like, we don't know who we are.
Yeah.
Because when my gram came back from the residential school, she probably felt like an outcast and just felt like she didn't belong, so she turned to liquor. And then the same thing happened through my family. We don't say I love you. I broke the cycle. I'm like, we gotta say we love each other.
Yeah.
And it's just, I feel if you take part in the traditions, then you feel more whole, and you just...
It's empowering.
It is.
Like, it's so empowering when you go into a sweat. Like, I can go into a sweat and feel it can be just a completely off week, and I've got a lot of stress, and it's just really heavy on my shoulders and on my heart. And I can go into a sweat and literally come out of the sweat feeling so alive and rejuvenated. I'm exhausted because, it's exhausting to work through those emotions and to let those emotions out. But
I'm crying like a baby every time I'm in there.
But the next day it's like, yes, back to me again.
Okay, last question. Are there any ways you can think of to fight for our rights in a non-violent way? And also, what are your thoughts about the Every Child Matters movement? Because that's also fighting with nonviolence for the rights for our ancestors and our elders.
Repeat the first part of the question.
Oh, is there any ways you can think of to fight for our rights in a nonviolent way?
Well, I think that violence is unproductive. First of all, that's my stance on that. I think that we can make movements and make change and leave an impact without resorting to violence. And the things we can do is educate ourselves. So if we educate ourselves, we are giving ourselves tools, and we're not going to resort to guns or anything like weapons, because we have the tools within us to fight certain battles. And what's the second part is?
Oh, the Every Child Matter.
That one? Well, I mean, every child does matter, absolutely. And they are our future generations, and we have to protect them. And the whole residential school legacy is a horrible history that, you know, we're finally just talking about, but only because really the bodies of those children that lost their lives at residential schools have been found, and it would probably still be a very deep, dark secret that only, you know, a small margin of the general population in Canada know about. But I believe that that's our ancestors, and our ancestors are making a movement, and they're no longer here anymore, but they're making the movement. They're pushing us to stand up. They're pushing the non-Indigenous people of the country, government, whatever it may be, to acknowledge, because you can't just sweep that under the rug. It's reality. It's sad, and I think that it's affecting for the most part all the Canadians, unless you lack empathy.
When did you first hear about residential schools in the school education system?
Oh goodness, like
Did you even learn about it?
I don't recall learning about residential schools. As a matter of fact, I grew up almost embarrassed because of my experiences when I told you about, you know, some of my friends not being able to come to my home. It seemed like the children who came from broken homes were okay. Like they were allowed to come to our home. And maybe that just is that, you know, their parents weren't real hands-on, or their parents had their own experiences where they couldn't, you know, they couldn't be effective parents. Much like many of our ancestors, and much like our grandparents and some of our parents. I remember in university, in one of my Aboriginal Studies classes, we had to read the book by Dan Paul, We Were Not the Savages. And it was the first time that I recall learning about accurate history about our ancestors. And it was one of the first times when I could genuinely say, oh my God, I have spent all these years of my life embarrassed and in shame about where I come from because of how other people treated me, because of other people's stereotypes, when in all reality, I should have been standing proud and saying, do you not understand what line of ancestry I come from, and the things that my ancestors did for your people when they arrived here in Canada? We were not the savages. And I think that this whole Every Child Matters and the exposure of residential schools and day schools and the 60 Scoop, all this stuff coming out now, speaks to who the savages were.
I think it's amazing how they thought we were savages because we didn't have Christianity, and what these residential schools were to assimilate our elders, but all they did was just almost commit genocide, basically.
Yeah. And like the people who did survive, you know, was a lot of broken people,
Mm-hmm.
which resulted in a lot of the issues you see in our communities now, unfortunately. But I feel like we are arming ourselves and we are educating ourselves and we are being given the opportunity to be proud of who we are, because people's views of us are now changing. People are showing more compassion, more empathy, because they know the true history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're going to see a really big shift in the country over the next 10 years.
Is there anything else you want to say before we end the interview?
Nope. Besides that, I'm really proud of you
Oh,
for
that
almost
was amazing.
completing your degree. And yeah.
Perfect.